New York Economic Club. You can be forgiven if you're checking your phone, you know, what's happening while I'm speaking. I wanted to just say a couple of words up top rather than write. I've been rewriting. It feels like every 20 minutes. Oh, I have to cross that one out, you know, to go to the next. Let me just make 4 quick points and let's get into some Q&A and hopefully we have some time for the audience too. Number 1, the Fed timetable is not the stock market timetable. And let's always remember that. Stock market is not the economy. We do look at it. I know it's sacrilege to come here and say that, but our goal is to find the through line when you're the central bank, not jump to conclusions. Just take the hard data, take the soft data, figure out standard of evidence high, time pressure relatively low. The market feels like it's the opposite. It's jumped to conclusions before anyone else has gotten to the conclusion. And in a way that moves us, as I describe it, the market is kind of like, and the consumer is like, and the Fed's job in that environment is to be the one to say, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened until the pilot indicates it is time to move about the cabin. You know, and we have come to a complete stop. And that topper, philosophical topper, let's call it, leads to point 2. The hard data looks pretty good, has been improving from a period of way too high inflation and a bizarre job market that was overly heated like none we had seen before. Supply disruptions, the whole bit. Everyone remembers that. We moved to what looked like stable, full employment, inflation trending down on path to 2%. And I said through 2024, that's what I would want to see for me to think that rates can start going down. And we started to see it. And more than started to see it, the unemployment rate, which had been getting worse for a year from a super low level, did stop deteriorating and has kind of hovered around 4%. As I say, full employment. Prices, if you look at the components, I was saying if we start to see improvement on housing and on services, not just on goods, that would bode well for if you saw the headline numbers coming down and the housing and services components improving, going back toward where they were pre-COVID, I would feel more comfortable that we're on path to 2%. I started calling that the golden path, that it felt like the golden path was possible. You could get inflation down without a recession. In a way, people then said, so you're a dove. So you're saying you're a dove. And I said, look, there's doves, there's hawks. I don't even know if I like birds. My intention is not to be a bird. It is to be one of the data dogs that the first rule of the data dogs, as I phrase it, is there's a time for walking and there's a time for sniffing. And the most important thing is to know the difference. And the time for sniffing is when there's uncertainty. And the time for walking is when you've figured out what the through line is. Fast forward to this moment. Now we come in with the hard data still pretty solid, but only observable with a lag. And we have proposals of biggest tariffs in 100 years. Plus, backed up to a pause at a level which is about the highest in 100 years. To me, that starts to raise the importance of going and looking at the soft data and talking to businesses themselves and consumers, because they don't have the lag that the hard data have. there is one element that imported goods are only about 11% of GDP. So there is an argument that if the tariffs, if they don't last too long, if the rates aren't too high, in a way it wouldn't be material to the overall economy. And that was the experience in 2018. We had tariffs. If you were in an affected industry, you saw prices go up, but they did not raise the inflation rate overall. And in a way, in a macro sense, you could look through them. So in the hard data, what would you be afraid of? How would tariffs jump out of their 11% lane? Number one, if the tariffs apply to components, parts, intermediate goods, now you jumped it out of just the 11%. Domestic producers' costs go up. When you see tariffs on steel and the domestic steel producers start raising their prices and the users of steel start facing higher prices, now it's outside of just the 11% lane. Number two, if there's retaliation, now you just doubled the impact of the tariffs because now all the exports are going to be affected, not just the imports. And then number three, if people start freaking out, the freak out channel is a well-recognized negative impact of any policy. So we start talking to executives. Are they front running and trying to preemptively buy a whole bunch of parts and components to stick them in a warehouse, in which case you might have a real drop off in activity when the actual policy event happens? Are consumers changing their behavior in anticipation of a deteriorating economy? Say, I need to build up a little safety net here for myself rather than spend at those levels. So that's turned us to thinking about the soft data and are people freaking out? Is the uncertainty slowing down their investment? And I got to tell you, with the 7th district is the most manufacturing intensive of all the Fed districts, and we're by far the most automobile industry intensive of the districts. There's a lot of anxiety. I don't need to tell you that. If you go ask them, there's a fundamental fear that we might be on the edge of going back to conditions like 2021 or 2022, where inflation's raging out of control and costs are on everyone's mind, and they don't want to go back to that. And then there are some even saying, maybe this is going to take us back to the 2020 kind of experience with supply disruptions and we can't get components. And that lasted far longer than it was supposed to. Okay, there is an argument that comes out of the soft data that it is on people's mind, at least uncertainty bordering on actual fear that is coming from all the things that they're reading in the paper and all the things that they're seeing. And that brings to the final point that I would make is, well, so what does that mean? How the Fed should react? And the problem is that's not, a tariff is like a negative supply shock. That's a stagflationary shock, which is to say it makes both sides of the Fed's dual mandate worse at the same time. Prices are going up while jobs are being lost and growth is coming down. And there is not a generic playbook for how the central bank should respond to a stagflationary shock. It's not like a regular demand shock in the business cycle where it's like, if you're overheating, you tighten. If you're cooling down, you loosen. Here, there's one school of thought that says, if you start to see a recession coming, you should lower the rates. Yes. If you see prices rising and the inflation rate going up, you should raise the rates. Yes. If there's a lot of uncertainty, you should wait and do nothing. Yes. Okay. And that's the the iron triangle of uncertainty that we need to sort out. Now, I want to continue to emphasize stagflationary shock, that's just about the direction. If you created a time warp and you could call 1975 and say, hey, you know about stagflation? We're dealing with stagflation. What should we do? They would say, what's your unemployment rate? About 4. What's your inflation rate? Well, as of this morning, 2.4. They'd be like, why are you bothering me? You know, your misery index, add those two things together, is under 7. Okay, let's remember, they went a long time with the misery index over 20, okay, in the 70s. Unemployment in the 7s, inflation in the 13s. That's what stagflation looks like. We're not there. The hard data are still solid. I still think underneath that, my through line, that if we can get out of this dust in the air period and just get back to the fact that we have stable, full employment and inflation trending down to 2%, in my head, the sooner we can get out of the uncertainty and just back to that, which is there, the sooner we can reflect what's in the dot plots. If you look at the dot plots and you ask, I should have said at the outset, nothing, guys, I can speak only for myself. I don't speak for anyone else on the FOMC or the Fed system. These views are my own. You go, whew, great relief, you know, by my colleagues. But in the dot plot, the vast majority of the FOMC says that they believe that rates will ultimately settle to a level that's well below where they are today. And I think that's true. And if we get back on that path, we can go back to rates heading down. And I still think that 1 to 2 years, 12 to 18 months from now, rates will be lower than they are today. We just got to get through a lot of bumpiness. Okay, so that's what I was going to say.
Perfect. Well, listen, very well organized and appreciated. Let me, we'll stay at the top of these 4 issues for a few minutes, then we'll go into policy things. Your third point, talk a bit about the soft data and what you're thinking about, what you're watching, so that we can all put ourselves in your mind and give us tools to understand that.
Okay, I like this question. I like ahead of time saying, here are the markers that let's be watching to determine which of these is right. So it's not the reason to care about how the stock market reacts, for example, is not that the stock market is the economy and we want the stock market to go up or not down. It's that we care about the real economy. I know these channels. What should make me nervous? What makes me nervous is when tariffs, as to take an example, jump out of their 11% lane. And one of the biggest ways that it jumps out of the 11% lane is if it affects what I call the freak out channel. Maybe that's an overstatement. I'm not conveying that it's irrational, but if it affects business and consumer sentiment enough that it changes their behavior, then it's relevant. So in the soft data, we have the 37 different round tables throughout the year where we're constantly talking to businesses throughout the district. But I'm hyper attuned to what is happening to business investment and consumer spending related to these measures of sentiment. So we've seen the survey measures of sentiment a little bit start to crater the last 2 or 3 months on both
pre the tariff discussion.
Even pre the tariff
I think that's important.
And it's still, at least I think, motivated some with discussions about tariffs, but pre the proposals. So we'll still have to see what comes in the next month. But some concerns of business sentiment slipping and soft data. If you talk to business people and they say, we're putting a pause on capital investment for 6 months until we figure out what happens, that is a disturbing indicator about how the economy's going to be doing as the data come in. When you get GDP now kind of estimates that in some sense are predicting recession, it can feed on itself. That sentiment, they get a couple of indicators and then sentiment goes down, and then low sentiment leads to less investment. So that's one space of the soft data that I think is relatively important. And then the second, in a way, seems more esoteric, but really goes to the heart of the matter. If you see in the market-based inflation expectations data, long run, which is what do people think the inflation rate is going to be 5 years from now? That's extremely important. As you know, Paul Volcker himself was my mentor, and he's a personal hero of mine. I worked with him through the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, 2010. The Volcker episode was as painful as it was because you didn't just have to slay the inflation dragon. You also had to slay the inflation expectations dragon. That everybody said, we think 5 years from now, inflation is still going to be 10%. So when they came down to do their wage negotiations, they're not going to take a 4% wage increase because they're going to be like, I think prices are going to go up 10% a year from now till then. And that spiral is very difficult to break. If you started to see long run market-based inflation expectations going up, that is, in a way, that's a softer data point, but it's an extremely important data point. I don't think that, in a way, that's the Fed's solemn promise. A 2% target is a covenant, is a vow that the central bank gives to the world. And it allows what happened this time, that look out the window, CPI inflation was almost double digits. But in the expectations, people, when they asked, what do you think the inflation rate will be 5 years from now? They said, I think it'll be about 2%. That's a sign they believe the Fed, and the Fed has credibility. If you started to see that break, the Fed has to stop that, almost regardless of the business cycle.
And how's that forward-looking perspective today?
Still okay, but a little concerning, which is to say, short run expectations are up materially. The longer expectations, at least in the market measures, have stayed pretty anchored. But you can't ignore, you're never going to hear me, the data dogs will never say, ignore, don't look at a data series. So I look at these survey measures, and in those survey measures, maybe it's not surprising because they see in the paper, if everybody's talking about tariffs and how they're going to increase prices, maybe it's natural that in surveys, people would say, I think prices are going to be up. But the more people think prices are going to be up, the more risk there is that it's not just transitory, that it gets kind of embodied in the system there. And that's a problem. Like I said, the Fed or any central bank almost has to address that if it starts to happen, regardless of what the other conditions are.
Well, as you said, we saw what Chairman Volcker had to do to solve it. And, you and I'm the oldest, but I think, 20% rates is attention getting. And that's what it took.
When Paul Volcker passed away, his widow, Anka, gave me some of his things. And one of the things she gave me was that original piece of a 2x4 that they mailed him, and scribbled on it is, please lower these insane interest rates. And I keep that on the shelf in my office, right by my desk, for 2 reasons. Well, 2.5 reasons. A half reason to remind me of him. But the 2 real reasons. One, this is not just a game. This is not just the markets. What the central bank does, what the Fed does, affects real people. And 2, sometimes the Fed has to do the hard job. Mm-hmm. And that's why they set up the system to have monetary independence. Absolutely. That we have. Because you know that if there's political interference in the Fed doing its job, Volcker type moments are massively more difficult. that sometimes you have to raise the rates a lot. You have to bear with the screaming, how can you do this? Because we've made a covenant with the economy, with people, that we will get inflation to 2%, and we will.
Well, I think the point you make, which is so important to remember, is that the authority that's bestowed with independence
Yes.
gives you the ability to do this.
Yes.
That if you have a direct line of authority with a political transmission, then it's too tough.
Yeah, and this is not, I didn't come to this viewpoint when I joined the Fed two and a half years ago. When I was an economist, economists are virtually unanimous on the importance of central bank independence for exactly this reason. That just look around the world at places where there isn't independence. The inflation rate is higher, the growth rate is lower, the unemployment and the job market are worse because political interference with the decisions of the central bank complicate the pledge that we will stabilize prices and maximize employment.
I think the observation of non-independence is you look in the last 10 days where the administration was on a path, but because of perspectives provided by business, by the Hill, and by the markets, then they adjusted because they aren't independent. And so we've seen this adjustment. Do you have a view on what you think the likely path is for the administration on, yesterday the pivot was to pause, and they had, I saw this morning, they've had 75, if you believe them, inquiries about how to resolve trade and tariff issues. How do you think, take us forward on how you believe the movie might develop? This isn't a Fed question. This is
no, that's what I say. You're going to get me in trouble here, Bob.
I hope so. But I think that as someone who lived in 1600.
Look, I was in a job where I thought a lot about fiscal policy, and I'm not in that business anymore. And as I say, our motto, Chicago Fed motto, like Chicago City motto, is there is no bad weather, there's only bad clothing. You tell me what would be the conditions, and I'll tell you, here's a jacket that we're supposed to wear. Fiscal policy are the conditions. Congress, the president, can do whatever they want on fiscal. If they decide they want to have the highest tariffs in 120 years, they're going to have a highest in 120 years. Now we got to figure out what to do. The pause scenario, which is that we add 10% tariffs to the whole world and I was going to say 125%, but I guess in the last 2 hours now it's 145% on China, our third largest trading partner. That's the fallback position. That's a huge tariff. Okay, we should not, in our scenarios in the run-up, 10% on the whole world and something materially higher, let's call it 25% just on China. That was our mega size case. That's in a way become the new floor. My view is that, as Volcker used to say all the time, 2008, 2009, 2010, when the crisis comes, the only asset that you actually have is your credibility. And so he's fiercely protective. Don't change the policy with this week, next week, the week after, because then people don't know. They just pull back and pause. That we've gone from even higher tariffs down to 10. Will it apply? Will there be exceptions? 90 days from now, we're going to revisit. I don't see how we can. For the people whose argument is let's look through the tariffs, that's in a theoretically pure tariff. If you had a one-time tariff that increased the cost and then stopped increasing, that would be a transitory inflation shock. If you have retaliation, if you have escalation, and if you don't know whether there will be exemptions, that's not the right world. So I mostly came up with a long way to answer. I have no idea. But my argument is the fact that we have seen these changes in the last couple of weeks further emphasized to me this is a time for sniffing, not walking. You would and I think we need to wait to see what the resolution is going to be.
Thanks. Let's move on to a few other topics, and we could go on this forever for the whole time, but I think it's important. One of the things that's been a constant drumbeat is the idea of rebuilding manufacturing in this country. As someone who's really looked at this, talk a bit about the reality of manufacturing and the imports. And sometimes I didn't say I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to a little bit. I'm not sure. I'm not sure manufacturing onshoring is really the holy grail of things. But talk a bit about how you think about labor force and manufacturing. And we had a speaker at the club earlier in the week who pointed out that the average manufacturing job is about $25 or $27 now. But if someone's starting as an electrician, it's $150 an hour. And are we kind of thinking about, but comment a bit about how you think about labor force and things like that.
There's a lot of deep issues in this question, as you know, and that's why I like it. I would say, I already told you, 7th district, we're the most manufacturing intensive of the whole Fed system and the economy. So manufacturing is still quite important in our regional economy and for the nation. That said, the basic dynamic that any economist would tell you is there's productivity growth over time, especially in manufacturing. So the cost of manufactured goods goes down and down over time. And as the price of TVs gets cut in half, you don't necessarily buy 2 TVs. As a price of the real price of cars goes down with productivity, you don't start driving 2 cars. And so a greater and greater share of people's budgets over time has shifted to services, and that dominates the US economy. The share of employment that is manufacturing has gone down somewhat steadily over time. And that's not true just in the US, that's true almost everywhere.
Yep.
The richer you get, the more services dominate the economy. That said, there's still a lot of manufacturing in the United States. We're still a leading manufacturer in a lot of, they tend to be higher skill, higher tech manufacturing. And the supply chain is far more intricate and interconnected for that kind of manufacturing than the traditional, hey, we're making bread, we need flour, we need an oven, we have salt, yeast, water, boom, bread loaf. You got these shipping back and forth, it's one form and now it's a component in a different one. I think the labor force part of that is tied to the best thing we got going for us is that everybody who's new coming into the labor force wants to find a good career that they can do it. And the individual atoms are so much more collectively wise than government central planner, even than businesses or the economic club. We're not going to decide whether manufacturing is a good job or a bad job for 15 years from now. Every student, every person coming in the labor force is trying to figure that out for themselves. I do wonder, it does puzzle me why the skilled trades, the pay is really high, yet there are shortages and the training programs aren't that long. Why isn't there flooding of the training programs?
What's the policy response? Because it's a puzzle, and you and I think that seems odd. Why isn't it self-correcting?
I've heard a couple of things about it, and I don't know what we have some labor force experts at the Chicago Fed in our research department who have tried to analyze some of these. Some combination of there are in some places regulatory barriers to entry into the occupational licensing and entry into the professions. There have been significant cuts to community colleges around the country who have been the traditional providers of this. And
then there's one group they're sort of the optimists. They're like, if you just give people the information, then they will choose to go do this. So it's not advertising, but a little bit. We need to advertise better what a good career this is. And especially in an environment in which there will likely be a lot of construction. We need to build housing. We need to build these infrastructure things. So skilled trades are in shortage, and you can make a good case. Some combination of those three.
Yeah, you and I intellectually believe the last, which is that the market will solve itself. And if these good jobs, if there is the demand for these jobs,
in a way, we've got to tap into the market to do most of the lifting. It is at the end of the day, 90+% of where growth comes from has nothing to do with the government. It's the private sector doing its thing, and every individual decision maker is got to follow these market forces. But we can both see there are things where the market is failing, and licensing or other training plays a key role.
In a recent interview, Secretary Besant said his number one priority, or he thought the number one priority should be reducing the government deficit, making government more efficient, and taking out expense. As he likes to say in his his description is that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a cost problem, is the Secretary's framing. Talk us through thinking about that, and we'll get to his other two issues.
He's just trying to get me in trouble over and over. That's 100% fiscal policy. That's on both sides.
But you said you're not here on behalf of the Fed.
Taxes and the spending, both of those are fiscal. So let's walk through three parts. One, if you've interacted in government, if you've got your driver's license renewed, if you got your real ID, the real ID is going to expire next month or something. There's definitely bureaucracy in government at many levels. How one goes about streamlining the government to improve it, not make it worse, that's a lot harder, and they're going to have to think through some of those issues. If we look at revenues versus expenditure levels in the government, look, it's an aging population. We know that the long run fiscal trajectory, the spending, because there's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, et cetera, the implications for spending levels are that spending will be higher than it ever was before as a share of GDP. And so either they're going to deal with the spending side, or revenues are going to have to be higher as a share of GDP than they were before. And that's kind of that's the fundamental choice that's got to be made by the American people. And I always said, there's dysfunction in Washington, especially on these issues. But that dysfunction in Washington, it's not just the fault of Washington. No. That dysfunction is in our brains, the voters. That if you ask people, do you agree with Republicans that spending is out of control and needs to be cut? Massive majority say yes. And then if you give them a list of here are all the parts of government, which one do you think should be cut? No, 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 no. They said they don't consider entitlements to be spending. If anybody said that they were going to cut that, they would throw them out of office. So in a world where people want most of the spending to even increase and they want the size of the government to shrink, you can see why the political leadership is at a bit of an impasse. The feds, we're in this economic stabilization business. Again, these are the conditions. If we look at what the proposals are, if they're going to cut the deficit, we'll look at what does the implied fiscal impulse, what is it going to do to growth? What is it going to do to productivity? How is it going to affect the economy? And we have only one tool. We have a screwdriver. We can tighten, we can loosen, and we can't make you breakfast. We can't do more than that.
Yeah, this is this is in your lane, but you might duck anyway. You recently had a change.
You have a little confidence in me.
You have a regulatory responsibility at the Fed. and there's been a change with the people that are leading that.
Yes.
And how do you think that, how will, when you get together with the FOMC and talk about that, help us think about regulation and how things might move or shift, and help us understand.
Okay, first thing
Is that
to know
fair?
about
That's
the
fair,
Fed
I think.
system. It's fair, but with one wrinkle. We have a board of governors, Washington, D.C. Jay Powell is the chair. They're political appointees. They are the ones who vote on and determine regulatory policy for the financial system. The 12 reserve banks, we are delegated that responsibility from Washington. So we don't set the policy. They tell us the policy and we execute on that policy. And the bank supervisors for our member banks, they will be housed at the Chicago Fed. The approach that if Mickey Bowman is confirmed as vice chair for supervision, she comes from a community bank background and focus of attention. Very different approach. It sounds like than Vice Chair Barr had. But I don't weigh in on either what's coming or what should come, because that's not our role. It's execution. I will say that Governor Barr, Vice Chair Barr and Governor Bowman have both been to Chicago Fed. We've had them talk to our people. When Governor Bowman has come out, we've done 2 Fed Listens events with her. She is very in touch with ordinary banks and businesses and is out. She's kind of in the style of a reserve bank in a way that has not always been true of governors.
So if I try to put words in your mouth, the perspective might be a little more tailored for the size of the institutions and more sensitive to the representations of smaller, more local institutions, as opposed to a size fits all kind of thing.
Yeah, it might be. I think in public statements, that's kind of been the approach, that there be some change. But we're in an environment where you've seen Secretary Bessent and the administration arguing for deregulation and changing the rules.
That was the second point of his 3.
Yeah, that was the second point of his 3. And their argument is they believe it can unleash lending, can increase productivity growth. If true, you might want to, we can talk about, given the structure of everything that it is today, if the vice chair for supervision changes, how will the application be different? That's a whole separate question of if there is a deregulatory change in capital requirements, liquidity requirements, and any of these things. To me, that feels like back to our original theme of finding the through line. That's kind of the through line that would be most important.
In your the next to last paragraph, you just said, you mentioned the word productivity.
Was that a little dig at the next last paragraph? You just said you want some sentences. Okay,
no,
fine.
It's all good.
I'll be tight.
I'm very pleased.
Yeah.
This is great. Appreciate it. I think, but I'm paying attention.
Okay.
You use the word productivity and talk, and you mentioned productivity earlier. We know that's really that's part of the really important ingredients to making our economy successful.
Yeah, totally. If not the most important ingredient, it's wheat in the Wheaties. Like this is the productivity.
So talk about how you think of productivity, because it's so great because you're an academic by training, but you've also been a policy guy, right in the center of things. And how do we think about productivity, and what lever should we be pulling and help us, innovation, technology, you run with it.
And you've talked about since forever, productivity it's probably the most important data series, full stop. For sure, it's the most important data series that nobody's talking about. Okay.
That's
and in weeks where policy is up and down, the market is up and down, the rates are up and down, it's hard to think about these longer term issues, but we should. And the thing is, yes, the actual data series on productivity is noisy. And that's one reason why people don't follow the quarterly productivity announcement the way they do the CPI or the jobs day, because it's extremely noisy. That said, the last 2 years have actually seen a remarkable surge in productivity growth, well faster than the previous trend before COVID. And at first, people said, yeah, of course, it's just coming back. You know, if you forecast this trend from before COVID and projected it forward to 2025, yeah, we went down, you know, during COVID. Of course, there's a comeback. We're going to go back and get back on the rate of innovation that we were on for 20 years before. Well, we passed that. And now we're above that productivity. And so the question is, where did this come from, and is it going to last? And that makes a huge difference. It's the thing that determines our standard of living over the long run. It determines even in the short run, how fast can wages grow without inflation? How you cannot answer the question, is the labor market too hot? Is wage growth consistent with 2% inflation? A lot of people ask that. You can't answer that question if you don't know what the productivity growth rate is, because that determines how fast wages can grow without inflation. There is the possibility that this surge of productivity is tied to new technology like AI. I hesitate to say literally AI, because the economists look and they're like, AI is not big enough. It cannot explain why the overall productivity of the entire economy is up as much as it is. But there's some research that came out of the Chicago Fed, which documents, if you just lay out this, break up the US economy into 63 industry component parts and just rank them by the change in the productivity growth rate from pre-COVID to now. So not the level, but like how much did it go up? If among the top 10 are heavily dominated, 7 or 8 of them look like tech-related AI-using industries. And that, as I call it, is kind of tantalizing evidence that maybe there is a technology thing. And the thing about a technology-driven boom in productivity is, in the past, the big ones, they don't stop. They slow. So electricity comes in. First, you see productivity growth in electricity generation sector. Then, with a few years lag, you see productivity growth in the heaviest electricity using sector. And then eventually, again with a lag, people start orienting their whole business around how can we better use electricity. And then you get productivity growth in service sector in a bunch of those. Same happened with computers, same happened with telephones. If that happens, it'd be wonderful. We'd still have to think through distributional implications. Will it make accountants obsolete? And so now the accountant's got to go find a new job. But at the same time, that's what made us the richest country in the world. And that's what, if we got this productivity growth, it would be a blessing. And we've at least had a surge for 2 years. There's a cautionary tale from the 90s. There's a lovely tale from the mid to late 90s and a cautionary tale. The lovely tale is that was an amazing time. That was the highest satisfaction with the economy. Wage growth was really robust. Growth was really robust. It didn't generate inflation because we had a surge. Boom-let. Make sure to add the let. There was a boom-let in productivity growth. The cautionary tale is, don't get overly used to it. If you make all these investments counting on productivity growth going forever, and then it doesn't, even if it doesn't go down to zero, the overbuilding in anticipation of the internet growing at 30% a year forever led to a bunch of overhang, and we ended up having a recession. So you don't want to overreact to AI, but I do think there's some exciting possibilities that are coming from this new technological wave. And you've kind of seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I think to my mind, there's a technology wave, and there've been several boosters that have kept moving it. And AI is just the latest booster to file.
I like that. I like that
Help yourself.
of the boosters. Still, I'll credit you. But that is kind of I think, the same thing that the economists call general purpose technologies, that they come in waves, and then this wave spreads to more, and then they can build on it, and you got a next wave. So maybe the AI could play in that space.
It's just the next booster on this arc of technology. It's access, speed, price, mobility. All these are different small boosters that just move you along that arc.
And look, that in the way we talked about tariffs are a stagflationary impulse at the least to raise prices and reduce growth simultaneously. Technological innovations and productivity growth is the opposite. It's what you want. It's lovely. They reduce prices, they reduce inflation while increasing growth. And we had a little bit of that in 2023 as the supply chain healed from the damages. And as Steve Leisman described it, he said, well, it turns out the people that were right were team transitory, and there was an element that dynamic that the supply chain got worse and then it would heal was true. It just took longer than we thought.
Yeah, let's try to, we're running out of time. I think let's just touch on a couple of things and give you a chance to provide your wisdom on 2 or 3 topics, and then get to lunch. Immigration, help us think about what's the right policy forward on that.
Immigration has both demand and supply effects because the immigrants buy things and they're also workers. As you know, as everyone knows, the demographics of the native-born population in the U.S. looks just like advanced economies all around the world, which is to say, if we're just going off of our own generated population, our population is going to be shrinking. It's going to have a lot more retirees. So depending how it works, the fact that immigration was more than 50% of the labor force growth in the United States in kind of the pre-COVID period makes me a little anxious that we could get back into periods of labor shortage or gaps in what the growth is. But the main thing when there's immigration, we had more immigration than we expected. And that showed up in aggregate numbers like total payroll job growth was well higher than what we thought was sustainable. But it was because we were getting the denominator wrong. Population was actually bigger than we thought. So I've just advised everybody to look as much as you can at ratios like the unemployment rate or the hiring rate, the vacancy rate, because they are less subject to that problem.
One of your missions, as you reminded us, is inflation, and a key part of inflation are energy prices.
Yes.
And click on energy for a second and tell us what you're thinking, and please feel free to wander into policy and things like that, because I think we're all trying to figure this out. And that was the third of the Secretary Besant's planks.
That if you got more energy, that would be a deflationary kind of
and stimulative too.
Look, it would drive my mom crazy. My mom's in Abilene, Texas. They're on the edge of the Eagleford Shale or one of the shales, and it is a big oil producing. When I say the Fed doesn't look at energy prices or food prices when it's trying to get the through line picture, it's looking at core inflation. My mom is like, what do you mean you don't look at energy and food prices? That's a main thing that I have to pay money for. That's because those things are extremely variable. And so we don't think they give as clear a signal of what's the underlying. In the through line, trend line, if we are having energy innovations, which are long-term bringing down the cost of energy, I do think that's a positive supply shock. Look, we know when we've had oil shocks that drove up the price of energy, you know what happened. The real stagflations of the 70s came from that. And when we have cost shocks to energy, they have that stagflationary impulse. It's a deeper question. If you were going to move to cleaner energy sources, but they were more expensive, how should we think that through? I think those are more long. That's not really about stabilization in the short run of balancing the dual mandate. I think of that as more, that's more like in our productivity calculation. Fundamentally, I do think in the short run, if the price of energy is going up, that's like a negative productivity shock.
Yeah, I think that the idea to what you were saying is that if we let a shock be a positive, then a technology innovation that brings prices down is the opposite.
While output is increasing. And just don't get yourself into the cat chasing its own tail problem of, if people think there's going to be a recession, then oil prices and energy prices will go down in anticipation of low demand. But that's different from a supply shock. One is moving along a demand curve and one is, moving the supply curve.
Good. I think we're at time. And, I should have said at the start, we've been friends for a long time. So this is really a treat for me just to visit. I started my career in Chicago, and we share the University of Chicago in common, and we've had lots of shared friends. So for me, it's really been a special treat to have you at the club and have the chance to visit with you. And I think everyone should just join me in saying thank you with applause for being today.
Thank you, Bob. And